Good morning, everyone. Please have a seat. It's very good to see you all. My name is Andrew Grosso, and I'm the Senior Associate for Discipleship here at St. Michael, and you are stuck with me today, so I'm glad to be with you. Glad to have a chance to talk with you for a few minutes about some of the stories that we have in the Scriptures. Let me give just a brief word about our agenda for this morning. Many of you know that there is going to be a luncheon immediately following this talk upstairs in the Youth Center, the Women of St. Michael Luncheon. So we're going to wrap up just a few minutes earlier than we ordinarily would. I'm going to aim to be done around 11:20 or so, which will maybe give you 10 minutes or so to get upstairs and find a seat in time for the luncheon to begin. But what that means is that I'm going to move pretty quickly. So I want to try and leave as much room for discussion and questions as possible, but I will also try to keep us moving along. To that end, here's what I have in mind in terms of how I'd like us to tackle our text this morning. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the background that kind of leads up to this particular story, then talk about the story itself, and then we'll pause and ask some questions, make sure that everybody's kind of clear as to what the story itself is suggesting, and then we'll talk about some strategies for interpreting the story and trying to get some sense as to why the story fits where it does within the context of the narrative in Genesis and what's going on there. And then we can take some more questions, and then we'll wrap up with some concluding observations about what this story might tell us about our own observance of the life of faith. So along the way, I plan to kind of intersperse opportunities for some feedback and some questions. So if you do have a question, feel free to just kind of put it in the back of your mind, write it down, hold it in abeyance, and then at the appropriate time, feel free to ask it, because I very much hope we do have some discussion here. Let's begin with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Lord God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for the beauty of your creation. We give you thanks for the gift of life. And we give you thanks for the opportunity to gather and to study your word. And we ask that you would send your Holy Spirit into our midst, enlighten the eyes of our hearts and our minds, help us to see and know you as you were revealed in the Scriptures, and help us to apply the lessons that we learn to our lives, that we would be a testimony to your honor and your glory. For it is in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, we are going to take a look at chapter 34 of Genesis today. How many of you had an opportunity to read the text before you arrived? Okay, most of you, great. Then what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to read through the story right now. I will at one point kind of walk through a quick outline of the story just to make sure we've got the primary elements of the story clearly in view before we jump into our discussion. But before I do that, I want to set up the context within which the story appears. You know, why do we end up at this particular point in Genesis with this particular story? Now, Chris talked a little bit last week about Jacob and about Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah, and about the children they had, and kind of the way in which that provides a framework for understanding a lot of what happens to Jacob throughout Genesis. Where did we leave things last week? Last week we left things, Jacob was leaving the territory, the country from which Leah and Rachel had been raised, right? He was leaving the home of Laban, and he was headed out to pursue the life that God had called him to. So he had left Padan Aram, and he was heading back to the land of his father in Canaan. He had not told Laban he was leaving. Chris related the story of how Laban then pursues Jacob, catches up with him. They make a pact to go their own way, leave each other alone, so they end up managing to avoid conflict at that particular point. A couple of important things happen to Jacob and his family along the way as they're making their way back into Canaan. Jacob hears that he's about to meet his brother Esau. And you'll remember that when Jacob and Esau separated, things had not gone well for them. So Jacob hears as he's sojourning on the way to Canaan that Esau is coming. And by the way, he's got 400 men with him. So Jacob hears that and thinks, I'm in a lot of trouble. So he divides up his family, and he divides up his herds and his flocks and all his possessions. And he selects certain gifts that he wants to present to Esau as a way of trying to ameliorate what he anticipates is going to be Esau's anger. And he starts sending these troops of people ahead of him to meet Esau. So he gets this group of cattle and goats and sheep and everything, and he sends them off with a couple of messengers. And the messengers are told, when you get to Esau, and Esau says, who owns these cattle and who owns these sheep? You say to him, well, these are a gift to you, Esau, from Jacob, who is coming behind me. And And he does that 4 times. He sends out 4 packs of people with gifts and with cattle and with all kinds of tribute to Esau, so that when Esau finally meets him, Jacob hopes he won't be mad with him. Then when they finally get to the point where they're about to meet, Jacob takes everything that he's got left and he puts it behind him. He himself is kind of riding in the front, and he arranges his family behind him, and he puts Leah and her children up front, right where he is, and he puts Rachel and her son in the very back, because, you heard last week that he has a special affinity for Rachel and a special affinity for Joseph, Rachel's son. So he puts them in the very back where they'll be the most protected, and he puts Leah and her children up front with him, and he rides out to meet Esau. Much to his surprise, Esau is not overwrought with anger. He's not intent on violence. He's not intent on stealing from Jacob or doing Jacob harm. So there's this reconciliation scene between Jacob and Esau. And they end up going their separate ways. It's all fine. There's no immediate conflict, but they don't end up staying together either. So Jacob continues to go on. And then Esau kind of goes his own separate way. Jacob then travels from Succoth to Shechem, and that should ring a bell because that's one of the names that appears in our text for today. So he lands in the territory of the Hivites. This is a different clan than the Hittites. One of the things we got to keep clear is which particular group we're talking about. He's in the territory of the Hivites. And the Hivites are descendants of the sons of Ham. And if you remember back early in Genesis, we heard about Noah and Noah's sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. The Hivites are said to be sons of Ham, descendants of Ham. And Jacob kind of stops there and he sets up camp. And he kind of settles down a little bit. He pitches his tent there. He builds pens for his cattle. He even builds an altar to the Lord. So he kind of gives the appearance that he's going to stay there a little while. It doesn't look like he's just passing through. He does enough work to kind of, position himself as planning to stay there for a certain period of time. So that's what happens between the events that you discussed last week and the events that we're about to discuss in chapter 34. So then we get to chapter 34, and here we go. Here's the outline for what happens in this chapter. Dinah, who you will remember, is one of the daughters from Leah. Dinah goes out and is kind of hanging out with some of the people in the region there. And Shechem, who is a prince in the region, sees her, is attracted to her, and seizes her and takes her by force. But it turns out that he actually seems to have some affection for her as well. He loves her, maybe to his own surprise. He finds out that he actually has deep devotion towards her. So he says, well, I really want to marry this woman. I really want this woman to become my wife. So he goes to his father, who's presumably one of the rulers in the region. If Shechem is identified as a prince in the region, then it's reasonable to conclude that his father is probably also fairly prominent in the region. And then they go and they talk to Jacob. And they say, we would really like to have your daughter Dinah in marriage. My son Shechem would like your daughter. Let's talk about that. And Shechem, he appears to give every effort to try and be as generous as possible. He says, you set the bridal price as high as you want. You tell me anything you want, I'll give it to you because I would really like to marry Dinah. Jacob's sons hear about this and they are less than pleased. So they're actually starting to think, this is no good. This cannot stand. And they begin plotting to take revenge on Shechem and on Hamor and on basically the people of the region. So the sons of Jacob enter into a dialogue with Shechem and his father, and they say, well, the problem here is that you're not part of the covenant the way we are part of the covenant. We have this special covenant, and the sign of the covenant is circumcision. And in order for us to enter into marriage relationships with you, you have to be joined to us through the same covenant that we ourselves participate in. So you have to submit to circumcision. And Hamor and Shechem think about that, and they think, well, that doesn't sound too bad. So they, whatever. I mean, this gives you some sense of how badly Shechem wants Dinah to be. So they go and they talk to the men of the city and they say, well, look, this is all we've got to do. And they see this as a strategic move, right? They look at all the stuff that Jacob has. They look at the size of Jacob's clan and they think, not only will Shechem get Dinah as a wife, but we will be able to join ourselves to these people who are clearly very powerful, very wealthy, very well known. So good idea, let's do this. So they submit to circumcision, and then 2 days, 3 days later, as they're recovering, the sons of Jacob come and attack the city. Simeon and Levi in particular are identified, and they basically slaughter all the men in the city. And then the rest of the sons, now that the city is defenseless, plunder the city, take what they want, and leave the city, probably a smoking ruin. Jacob is not happy because Jacob says to his sons, you have now created a severe problem for me because you have made me odious in the eyes of the Canaanites. If word gets around what happens when Jacob rolls into town, then people are going to band together, and people are not going to want to put up with this. They're not going to want to be subject to the same kind of threat that what's happened here that the Hivites experienced. So this is no good. But the brother, his sons, the brothers, push back and they say, no, we had to do this. It was completely inappropriate that our sister was treated in this manner, so we have done right in this particular situation. And that takes us up to the end of chapter 34. Now, I do want to push just a little bit further into chapter 35, but not quite yet. I want to just stop now and kind of see if the summary that I've provided is consistent with your reading of the story, or if you have any initial questions just about the story itself, just the kind of the narrative details of the story. We'll talk about the interpretation of the story in a minute, but did the story sound familiar enough based on your reading to feel comfortable with us just proceeding? Any initial questions? Okay, good, here we go. So, a couple of things. This is a very difficult story. Right? This is a hard story to read. It's a hard story to hear. It's a hard story for us to make sense of. We may wonder, what is a story like this doing in the Bible? What are we supposed to do with this? Where is the spiritual benefit of this? One of the things that Chris talked about last week that I think is helpful to keep in mind here is the distinction between plan and purpose. You remember that distinction? Chris made the point that sometimes things don't go according to plan, but God is nonetheless able, out of whatever disaster may ensue, to continue to pursue God's purpose. And I think this story fits very well within the context of that distinction. One of the things that I think we want to note about this story is who is not present. Who is not present in this story? God. God is nowhere in this story, which is interesting because that kind of raises the question, well, are we supposed to understand that God had this in mind and God was planning for this and this was part of God's intention? There's nothing in the story to indicate that. And in fact, there's elements of the story that incline rather in the opposite direction. Immediately after this story, at the beginning of chapter 35, God reappears and says to Jacob, you need to move on because you have settled down, you're starting to intermingle with people, your family is starting to get themselves into trouble. This is not what I have in mind for you. So we're given to believe that Jacob, by kind of stopping in the region of the Hivites, by conducting himself and his family in the way that they were, by kind of making a home for themselves and thinking about, well, this isn't so bad, that doesn't seem to be consistent with what God actually had in mind for Jacob to do. So the fact that God reappears at the beginning of chapter 35 and says, it's time for you to move on. And then Jacob recognizes that if they're going to move on, then they have to change all the practices and get rid of all the foreign gods that they had kind of accumulated over their travels up to that particular point. Just before they push off, after God tells Jacob, it's time for you to move on, Jacob goes to his family and basically says, okay, everybody, throw out your idols. Get rid of all the stuff that you've taken into your house. I know you've got them. Throw out the foreign idols. Throw out all the foreign stuff. We need to remind ourselves we're God's covenant people. Let's keep moving on. Can we hold it for just a minute? Okay, great. Just one more minute. Hold up. So keeping in mind this distinction between plan and purpose, and keeping in mind the way in which God kind of disappears for a little while and then reappears and reorients Jacob, gives us a little bit of help, I think, with regards to understanding how we might think about this story. Some other things that I think we want to remember that help us think about the story without necessarily agreeing with everything about that the story might suggest has to do with differences between the way the people of the time would have thought about all the dynamics that happened, the way in which people thought about intertribal conflict, the way in which they thought about marriage, and the differences, the different ways in which we think about those things. For example, one of the differences between the way they thought about things in ancient times and the way we think about them is the different ways we think about the Bible itself. For us, the Bible is a collection of spiritual stories, and it's kind of a collection of moral lessons, and it's a collection of kind of high-minded, aspirational, inspirational illuminations on the life of faith. That's fine, but that's not an entirely adequate way of accounting for everything the Scriptures really present themselves as. Part of what's going on here is that you're getting a whole history of a people and their relationships with other peoples in the region. So we expect military conflict, and we expect tragic events like this, and we expect hardship, and we expect death, and we expect all manner of difficulty in the midst of the complexities of the human situation. So part of what we have to do with stories like this is, I think, recognize that the Bible doesn't always just give us sanitized accounts of human experience that are designed to inspire and illuminate us. They confront us with some of the harsh realities of every dimension of the human experience. So part of what we may need to think about is how we read the Bible and what we're reading the Bible for. Some other differences between the way we think about the world and the way the authors of these texts might have thought about the world have to do with the way they thought about individual identity. For us, individual identity is very important. We get very skittish anytime anybody suggests anything that we think infringes on our sense of autonomy, our sense of independence, our sense of freedom, and our sense of our ability to basically exercise agency and set the direction of our lives. People in biblical times didn't think that way. They thought primarily of themselves first and foremost as belonging to a group of people. They thought first and foremost in terms of corporate identity and only secondarily in terms of individual identity. So that affects the way that we might think about the relationships that we see presented in these stories. Similarly, they had different expectations about history. This is something that you've talked about with Chris before. One of the things that we expect when we read a historical account, what's the first question we all want to ask? Did this really happen? That is of secondary importance at best in many instances of stories that are told in the Bible. The question of whether or not it really happened the way it was articulated in the Scriptures is often secondary to the more fundamental question, what does this mean? What insight does this give us into the overarching arc of what the text is telling us about the way in which God is involved in the world? Because the story that's being told here is the story of God's salvation history and God's covenant relationship with Israel. So how does this story fit within that framework, not within the framework of what strictly did or did not happen historically? Because there's actually some evidence in the story itself that it's probably not historical. And I'll get to that in just a minute. And then the final difference I want to note between our culture and the culture of the ancient times, the culture of the Bible, is that we have very different sense of values. Our sense of the moral dimension of life and the moral values that drive and motivate us are very different from those people in biblical times. We tend to be much more driven and motivated by a sense of achievement. We, again, tend to be driven much more by a sense of independence and accomplishment. They were not driven by that. They were driven much more by honor. Theirs was an honor culture. And honor, within the context of an honor culture, relationships, the experience of shame in relationships, the exaltation of particular people in relationships, one's standing within the community, again, is much more important than any individual achievement or individual accomplishment. So all those differences, none of those differences give us, I think, a basis for excusing what we may find in the Scriptures at any given point, but hopefully they give us a framework for thinking about just how different the world of the Bible is from the world that we live in today. If we're going to understand the story, we have to do our best to try and get back into the mind of the people who were portrayed in the stories and the mind of the people who wrote the stories. Okay, so let me pause there, and before we start getting into some more specific interpretive strategies, let's just see if we have questions. Nancy, please. Yeah, the question was, let me see if I can rephrase the question, see if I've got this accurate. The question was, when Esau and Jacob meet, basically, why didn't they stay together, right? It's because it seems as if Esau is coming intent on reconciliation, intent on rejoining the family, intent on making a big clan, and intent on getting along. So why don't they meet? There's this interesting story that happens right before Jacob meets Esau. And if you've been kind of reading all the sections between, you probably bumped into this. Does anybody remember what happened the night before Jacob meets Esau? He divides his family and he divides his flocks and his herds and he sends some of them away. Jacob is alone for a night, and what happens? A man meets him and wrestles with him all night, right? And we don't ever hear, the text doesn't say God meets him and wrestles with him, but Jacob clearly knows this is somebody who can bless me. This is somebody much more powerful than I am. So they're wrestling all night long, and this is the famous story when Jacob's hip is put out of joint. At the end of the night, Jacob's basically got the guy in a chokehold, and the guy can't get away. So the guy dislocates Jacob's hip. And Jacob's still holding on, right? So Jacob is tenacious, if not nothing else. So then he insists that the man bless him. I think what that story suggests relative to your question is that Jacob, to some degree, is striving with God to determine what it is God wants him to do. What is God calling me to? And the fact that he's striving as hard as he is not only suggests his commitment to wanting to do what God wants him to do, but he's also kind of his own pride is at play there. I mean, the reason he ends up getting the name he does is because you have striven, the one who gives him the name says, you have striven with men and with God, and you have prevailed. Wow. Okay, well that says something. So I think the incident at Peniel, where Jacob spends all night wrestling, is part of an answer to your question. Jacob spends that night trying to figure out who he is, what he's supposed to do. I just left Laban. I've got all these flocks. I've got all these herds. I've got this huge family. I've got my brothers coming. What am I supposed to do now? I think the answer for that comes in part out of his encounter at Peniel. Yeah. Other questions at this point?
Let me ask you, why was the fellow, I can't remember his name, who assaulted Dinah so cavalier about the whole thing, and then, hey, now I want to marry her?
Shechem, yeah.
Was that prevalent? I mean, I know this is probably not a real true story, but
Yeah.
I had a hard time understanding. Was it common for a guy to see a girl, want
Right. Right, a sexual encounter with her, right, yeah.
Was that common? Was that done often? And
I-
his father said, fine, let's go make arrangements.
Yeah.
I thought that was very bizarre.
I think so. I think part of what that does, that Shechem is an interesting character in the story. I mean, on the one hand, he's horrific because he's brutal and he's selfish and he's prideful and he's, all the things that but then he becomes this guy who's kind of totally smitten with Dinah. Yeah, just lovesick with her, right? So what's going on there? I wouldn't want to say that was kind of standard practice during the day, but there is a Jewish tradition about this story. Why does he treat her the way that he does, and why does this happen in the first place? There's a Jewish tradition that leans into the description of what Dinah does at the very beginning of the chapter. Dinah goes out and basically is hanging out with the women of the city, right? So there's a suggestion that says, well, maybe he didn't recognize that she was a Jew. Maybe he thought she was just some Hivite woman or, just some woman of the streets or something or whatever. He may have not known exactly who she was when he took her by force. Now, that's a bit speculative. I think that goes a little bit beyond what the text suggests. But some of the rabbis, at least, in their attempt to try and figure out why would Shechem do this, why would he behave in the way that he does, have suggested that it was the fact that Dinah was not staying in Jacob's camp, but was out fraternizing with everybody else that first brought her to Shechem's attention. Okay, good to go? Keep going. Okay, let me mention two broad interpretive strategies, neither of which is terribly helpful, but both of which will be good for you just to know about, not only relative to this story, but to other stories, because these two interpretive strategies are used consistently to try and make sense of what we see going on in the scriptures, especially in the Old Testament. For many, many, many years now, Christians have distinguished between layers, as it were, layers of meaning in the scriptures. And the way this plays out looks something like this. Kind of in its classic formulation, some Christians have said, well, there's four layers of meaning in the scriptures. There's the literal meaning. What does the text say? What kind of an event is the text describing? What is the text actually communicating? That's the basic literal meaning. Next layer of meaning is the moral underlying. What is the moral principle or the value or the ethic that is being taught here? What moral truth might we glean from the story? If there's no particular obvious moral point being made, is there nonetheless a moral dimension to the events that give us some sense as to how we should conduct our lives? Okay, great. That's also one. Is there then also maybe an allegorical layer below that moral layer or deeper than that moral layer? Is there a character or an event or a figure in this story that helps us recognize the way in which this story might be connected to other stories in the scripture? So, for example, in some traditional accounts of the reading of the Old Testament, you will often see, especially early Christian biblical commentators, they'll say, well, the Ark of the Covenant. Oh, the Ark of the Covenant. Well, that's a clear allegorical sign of the Virgin Mary. Because what does the Ark of the Covenant suggest but the fulfillment and the consummation and the presence of the Word, the law right there in the Ark? Well, that looks like Mary in the New Testament. So there's kind of a typological connection or an allegorical connection between an image or an event in one story and an image or an event in another story. So we've got the literal, the moral, the allegorical or the typological, and then the final one is the spiritual meaning. How does this story help inform the way we think about God? How does this story elevate our awareness and elevate our consciousness to draw us away from the things of the world and towards the things of God? And especially, how does it help us think about the life to come? So that interpretive strategy is one that Christians have used for many, many years now, especially when dealing with stories like this. Because it's often helpful sometimes if what you're trying to do is make sense of a difficult passage to say, well, literally this story may not have a lot to offer, but morally the lesson might be, oh, that's helpful, or there might be an allegorical connection here that helps me understand this other story over here. So all of that is to say that it's not infrequent, especially with Old Testament texts, to read back through the history of biblical commentary and biblical interpretation, to see Christian commentators talking about those four layers of meaning. I mentioned that, as I alluded to earlier, primarily because it's helpful for you just to be aware of that as an interpretive strategy for thinking about Old Testament stories in general. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be a strategy that a lot of Christians have used with this particular story, which is kind of unusual. It's kind of surprising. I mean, it's noteworthy that this story has not received more attention than it has using that kind of framework, because you would expect, I mean, this is a classic definition. This is a classic example of a difficult story. What do we do with this? Well, you would expect that kind of careful analysis and that parsing of meaning to be one of the ways that people would try to engage this. But that doesn't seem to have been the case in the history of biblical commentary. So we don't have much help for us there with regards to how to understand some of the details of the story. What about another interpretive strategy that is less theological or less spiritually minded and a bit more textual, a bit more academic? You've heard Chris allude to the fact that the Old Testament presents us with actually layers of different textual traditions. There's a textual tradition or a layer of text in the Old Testament stories that appears to have been written a very, very long time ago, about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. And then there's another layer that appears to have been written about 150 years after that, and then two other layers below that. So all of that is to say that if we look at the Old Testament as a collection of writings, it looks like they were written by multiple authors over a period of several hundred years. And we can discern the different layers of meaning and say, okay, well, it looks like this particular layer of meaning, the authors are concerned with these kinds of questions, might have come out of this particular region, this particular whatever purpose, and this other layer looks a little different. The concerns are different. The names used for God are different. Maybe some of the priorities are different. This this particular strategy does maybe give us some insight. There's no real agreement on this, but some scholars have suggested that if you look at the text of Genesis 34 in this way, you can discern some of those different textual layers, some of those different textual traditions. And it looks like maybe this story was written in a way to serve the theological and spiritual agenda of the tribes of the southern kingdoms. Now, you'll remember that at one time, Israel gets divided into a southern kingdom and a northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom is dominated by the tribe of Judah, and the northern kingdom contains a whole number of other tribes. There's other tribes other than Judah in the southern kingdom, but Judah is the primary one. Judah is the one from which the lineage of David comes from, right? David comes from the line of Jesse. Jesse is a Bethlehemite. Where is Bethlehem? Right there in Judah. So there are some authors who've suggested that it looks like the way that Simeon and Levi are portrayed in this particular story give us some insight that would be particular to a southern author, an author who's maybe writing about and wanting to justify things that are going on in the southern kingdom. In other words, what this might be is this might be somebody attempting to try and demonstrate through historical narrative why the tribe of Judah is so important. Because if Simeon is a southern tribe and Levi is a southern tribe, and they're both born before Judah, you would expect that Simeon and Levi's tribe and Reuben's tribe as well. Reuben, you'll remember, is the firstborn, right? Excuse me. Reuben is Leah's firstborn son, and then Simeon, and then Levi. Well, they're the most important because they're the oldest sons. Why aren't they more prominent than Judah in the southern kingdom? Judah's the fourth son. Simeon and Levi blow it. Simeon and Levi blow it right here, given their treachery with the Hivites. So they lose their prerogative. In, I think, the next chapter after this one, Reuben blows it. So Reuben basically sets aside his prerogative as firstborn son, which leaves Judah. So if you're a southern author who is trying to make a case for why Judah is so important and why the line of David is so important, one of the ways that you might do that is by explaining why the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, all of whom were from the elder brothers to Judah, why those tribes are not as important and why Judah is actually the principal tribe. So that's another way of coming at this story that is based more on that analysis of different textual traditions rather than trying to glean a particular lesson or moral or spiritual lesson from it. But again, there's not a ton of agreement on that. It's just an interpretive strategy that I think helps give us a little bit of purchase as to some of the ways in which we can approach this story. Okay, I've got a few other thoughts. Let me check my time here. I've got a few other thoughts I want to share about this. Let me just pause and see if there's any questions at this point. Okay, what happens to Dinah after this story? Do we ever hear from Dinah again? There's one reference to Dinah after this story, and it's kind of just a passing reference. When Jacob takes his family down to Egypt, you'll remember that later in Genesis, several chapters after this one, Joseph is separated from the family and is sold into slavery by his brothers. He goes to Egypt. He rises to prominence as one of Pharaoh's assistants, and there's a famine in the land. And Joseph's brothers show up looking for food. You remember the story of Joseph and his brothers, right? Okay. Joseph invites Jacob and everybody to come down to Egypt. Dinah is listed among those who go with Jacob and his family down into Egypt. But she's just, and her brothers Zebulun and Naphtali and Dinah. And there she goes. So there's not much indicator there that anything really of significance had happened to Dinah between the time of the encounter with the Hivites and going down into Egypt. But there is another story that comes out of traditional rabbinic teaching, traditional Jewish teaching that is not in the scriptures, but some of the rabbis have speculated on this a little bit and said, well, actually, there's a tradition that suggests that there was a daughter that was born out of the union of Shechem and Dinah. And Jacob didn't know what to do with that daughter, so he basically gave her away. And she was taken into the home of Potiphar of Egypt. And she ends up, the daughter that comes out of this union, ends up marrying Joseph when Joseph goes to Egypt. Interesting, okay? Now what does that do, right? Why would you speculate that? What's the problem that just gets solved there? What's the problem that story seeks to address? Well, clearly, one of the concerns for the people of the time, not just the Jews, but pretty much everybody, one of the concerns for the people of the time has to do with intertribal marriage and intertribal relationship. You'll remember that when Jacob goes to Laban and asks for Rachel's hand, what happens? He ends up with Leah. And he says, what have you done? And what does Laban say? Well, we don't give away, right? We don't give away the younger born before we've given away the firstborn. Firstborn comes. So Laban has this concern. We see that the sons of Jacob are furious with regards to the way their sister is treated at the hands of this Hivite. They have this concern. So all the tribes, all the peoples in the region are very concerned with marital relations and how marriage works and who you get connected to through marriage. If Joseph goes to Egypt and marries someone who is outside the covenant people entirely, that potentially presents a problem. But if we can get somebody who has some connection to the covenant to Egypt in time for Joseph to marry her, that problem goes away. Pretty ingenious, right? It's pretty creative. But there is this tradition about Dinah that suggests that out of her encounter with Shechem, a daughter is born who is then basically abandoned, ends up in Egypt, and is raised and is there waiting for Joseph when he arrives. And then Joseph meets her as he's coming to power, as he's rising to prominence. And then they get married, and she's the one who gives birth to his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And then those two sons are brought into the covenant. Those two sons are fully incorporated into the covenant. Joseph is not given an allotment of the land in the promised land, but his two sons Manasseh and Ephraim are. Well, how do we justify giving land to these two sons of this guy who married somebody outside the covenant? Well, he actually didn't marry someone outside the covenant. He married somebody who had a connection to the covenant people. Okay, interesting, creative. But that's about all we know about what happens to Dinah. What happens to Simeon and to Levi? Simeon basically carries the reputation of being a violent, brutal man all the way through the rest of his life. There's a tradition that is not in the scriptures, but there's a tradition that suggests that Simeon is the one who comes up with the idea of killing Joseph when his brothers are angry with him and they're jealous of him and that guy didn't think so highly of himself. Simeon is the one who says, let's get rid of him. Now, there's nothing in the text that says that, right? But later on in the story, when the brothers come to Egypt and they're looking for food and they're seeking relief from the famine, and they go before Joseph, and Joseph is there as the right hand of Pharaoh, and Joseph sends them back to their father with instructions as to how they are to avoid famine, he takes Simeon captive. He treats Simeon more roughly than the rest of them, and he binds him, and he forces them to stay there in Egypt while the rest of the family goes back. Well, some have suggested that looks like Joseph is getting just a little bit of revenge on Simeon for being the brute that he was. So Simeon continues to kind of implicitly be presented as this guy who always thinks with his temper first, and he always thinks he's inclined to violence. Even when Jacob dies, Jacob's last blessing over his sons, his last blessing over Simeon and Levi, the two who were responsible for the slaughter of the men of the Hivites, it's not a great blessing. Jacob says this, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. May I never come into their counsel. May I not be joined to their company, for in their anger they killed men, and at their whim they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So on the deathbed of Jacob, we've got a portrayal there of an acknowledgement that if you get Simeon and Levi together in the same room, there's going to be trouble. The Levites, interestingly enough, are the ones who are appointed to serve as priests on behalf of the rest of Israel. So there are some who have said, well, the reason Levi is as violent as he is because of his zeal and his passion for the Lord. And that's what motivates him. Simeon is motivated, it seems, by his predilection for violence and his temper and his his kind of irrationalism. Levi is motivated by a strong sense of zeal. And Simeon being the younger of Levi being the younger of the two is easily influenced by his stronger, more forceful, more violent brother Simeon. So that's why you got to divide those two. You just can't put those two in the same room and expect there not to be trouble. So Simeon and Levi kind of continue to carry this reputation for much of the rest of their lives. I think those are all our principles. So a few other things just to note. That I think this story suggests for us. There is a consistent demonstration in this story, in the stories leading up to it and in the stories after it, for the question of intertribal marriage. Why is intertribal marriage such a concern for the people of the time? Well, it has everything to do for the Israelites. It has everything to do with the covenant. And we see Simeon and Levi leveraging this, right, in a deceitful way in their conversation with the Hivites. We are a covenant people. And because we are a covenant people, we have to behave in a particular way. And there is a sign that identifies us as a covenant people. So we cannot simply arbitrarily enter into any kind of relationship with people who are not part of that same covenant. So this sense of intertribal relationship and intertribal marriage, the way in which intertribal marriage affects the boundaries of the covenant and the observance of the covenant, is something that's clearly testified to in this story. The other thing this story potentially points to is a history of complicated relationships between Israel and the Hivites. In other words, this story might reflect something that is a consistent problem for Israel that is reflected elsewhere in the scriptures. In the book of Joshua, specifically in chapter 9, the Hivites and the Israelites meet again. And it goes about the same. It's not a happy encounter, but here's what's interesting about it. By this time, Jacob is gone. The people have been down in Egypt for a time. They've come up out of Egypt. They're making their way into the promised land. So Joshua is leading the people, and he's got thousands of people at his back. And they move into a particular region, and there's a bunch of people, a bunch of other tribes in that region who say, we got to get together. We got to get together and band together and protect ourselves against these marauding Israelites. And the Hivites decide not to go that way. The Hivites do something different. The Hivites decide they're going to deceive the Israelites. So they go to the Israelites and they say, hey, we don't live here either. We're just passing through. We're travelers like you. See our sandals? See how worn out our sandals are? See how worn out our clothing is? Look at this dry, moldy bread. This is all we've got. We've been on the road. We're just passing through. You're just passing through. I'll tell you what. Let's just let each other go in peace. We'll not molest you. You don't molest us. Everybody just kind of lives in peace. And the Israelites are like, okay, fine. If you're not sticking around, if you're just passing through, we make a treaty with you. We will not assault you. You will not assault us. Then they find out the Hivites live there. And the Hivites are like, you promised, no attacking us. And Israel is kind of stuck. They can't now attack the Hivites because they've made this pact with them. So both of these stories, the story of the slaughter at Shechem and the story of the encounter between the Hivites and the Israelites in Joshua, suggest that both stories might give us some insight into the history of the relationship between these two people. It appears to have been a contested relationship, to say the least. Were you going to ask a question?
It seems like this discussion was more about men than Dinah, or women, or a study of women in the Bible.
Yeah, Dinah doesn't really, the question was, this story seems to be more about the men than it does about Dinah. One of the noteworthy things about this story is that Dinah doesn't have a lot of agency here, right? And I want to say something about that in just a minute. Dinah has things done to her, but Dinah doesn't do much. Hold that thought for just a minute, because I think there's an important spiritual lesson for us in that. But I want to save that for last, okay? Okay, we've talked about other interpretive strategies that people have used to try and make sense of this. There's a couple of other kind of traditional interpretations that some rabbinic scholars have tried to use to make sense of this. For example, there's a rabbinic tradition that says, well, Dinah was assaulted because Jacob had done something that angered God, so God was actually punishing Jacob. There's a couple of different ways that's described. Not sure that that's terribly helpful, but there is kind of a tradition about that. There's also a couple of traditions, interpretive traditions here that treat this story. How is it that moral responsibility is shared? And there's rabbinic scholars on both sides of that question. There are rabbinic scholars who say the whole community is responsible for the moral well-being of everybody in that community, and there are other scholars who say, no, that's overbearing, that's too much weight for anybody to carry. There's a measure of individual responsibility that simply cannot be borne, that cannot translate to the community as a whole. So part of what we see going on in this story has to do with moral responsibility and the way in which people are morally responsible for one another within the context of a given community. Okay, now let me get to a few concluding thoughts that I think give us just a little bit of hope for ways we might read this story profitably. And here's where I want to get to your question about Dinah. There's a couple of things in this story that I think give us some indication of themes that will reappear in the New Testament. For example, there's a kind of a classic line of interpretation here that's been around for many, many years. Cyril of Alexandria, way back over 4th century, was the first to suggest this. Who suggests that Jacob's word against his sons, the argument that we see Jacob having with his sons, not to use violence, and Jacob's condemnation of Simeon and Levi, is reminiscent of the words that Jesus speaks to Peter about not taking up the sword. You remember the story in the Garden of Gethsemane. Peter tries to use a sword to defend Jesus, and Jesus says what? Put that away, right? Don't use the sword. Don't use violence as a way of trying to solve problems. Cyril says, well, there's an echo there between the story of the slaughter of the Hivites and what we see Jesus teaching his disciples about not using violence. Jacob's condemnation of his sons is picked up by Jesus and used as a way of describing what real faithfulness looks like. There's also, I think, something interesting about Dinah herself. Can you think of someone in the New Testament who experiences violent assault, but who then manages to change the hearts of those who assault him? Jesus himself. Right? What does Jesus experience on the cross? Right? Violent assault. Right? But what happens afterwards? Some of those who are in attendance see the suffering that Jesus experiences, and their hearts are turned. Their hearts are turned. Saul's heart is turned. There's a pattern in the New Testament of people recognizing what happens to a heart that is soft enough to be transformed when it sees unjust violence being executed against an innocent person. So the transformation that happens in Shechem's heart is itself a sign of the grace and the fortitude and the perseverance that Dinah herself exhibits. And it's not something that she does explicitly. It's not an action that she takes. It's something that she's able to do without doing anything at all, which is kind of the same way the grace of God works. And we see that in the way that people's hearts get transformed when they recognize the cross, a sign of brutality and a sign of violation and a sign of death, when they see that and say, that's the means through which God is saving the world. So I think Dinah gives us kind of an implicit echo of something that we see more fully manifest in the person of Jesus himself. Dinah, through her suffering, and Dinah, through her perseverance and her willingness to hold on to her integrity in spite of her suffering, manages to transform the heart of Shechem. He sees in her a grace and a dignity that changes him as a person. And I think the same thing happens when people recognize and see in Jesus one who is similarly... I'm sorry, hold on. Hold on. There is something similar going on, I think, in the way in which the New Testament presents people's encounter with the cross. So please, you were going to say? What were you going to say? Serves a purpose. Yes, exactly right. Yes, that capacity for redemptive suffering serves a purpose, even if it's not according to plan. Yeah. Yes.
I think you have to dig really deep. I think what you said, had she not married him, she would have been a woman of sin, right? Nobody else would have wanted to marry her. Why not? Did he go to Egypt with her when she went, when she later? And thirdly, it seems to me that everything that happened was her fault, not the man's fault.
No, say that again, sorry.
Everything that happened to Dinah was, her fault. In other words, if he hadn't married her, she would not have much value as a woman, and that's continued today when rape and things like that happen, where it tends to be the woman's fault because she was out and about, not really in with, her family when he saw her out and about. So maybe he assumed she had no morals because she was out and about and away from her group when he saw her.
Yeah. So the question is, if I've understood your question right, I think what you're saying is, does the story actually implicitly blame Dinah? Is that your question?
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, I don't think she had a choice. She had no choice. I mean, she was accosted, and then he said he wanted to marry her, and then so it happened. Whether she wanted to or not, she had no choice. I'm sure she didn't fall in love with him immediately over that.
No, there's no indication that she ever fell in love with him. Right. To be clear, there's no indication that Dinah ever falls in love with Shechem, right?
They didn't marry, did they?
Well, but this is a little interesting. There is an old Jewish interpretive strategy here that suggests that she ends up in the house of Shechem after his assault, after he rapes her. He does take her into his house in anticipation of marrying her. And she refuses to leave when Simeon and Levi come because, and we're not really clear as to why, but it seems like maybe she can't bear the shame of going back to her family after having experienced what she does. Simeon promises to marry her as a way of redeeming her, and as a way of kind of welcoming her back into the family, into the covenant.
Marrying her or marrying her to somebody else?
Marrying her himself. Yes. Keep in mind, this is where the difference between us and them becomes important. The difference between us and them is essential here because we look at that and we think, well, that's not much help. They look at that and think, oh my goodness, they redeemed her. They redeemed her. They did not leave her to her fate. They were determined to bring her back into covenant relationship with the rest of the family. They were determined not to abandon her. They were going to make sure that she had everything she needed to live the rest of her life. Good for them, right? That's kind of the way in which the story posits that. Now, there's a lot that many of those interpretive strategies that we've talked about read things into the story that are not in the story itself, which I think gives us an indication of just how difficult this story is for a lot of people to make sense of. But I think this is why, again, I'm alluding here to something Chris said last week, this is why talking about the story and attending to the details of the story and thinking about the way in which this story links up with other stories, that kind of process can be really helpful. Because if we just lift any part of the scripture out and just say, well, here's this one little piece, but what do we do with this? What's the spiritual lesson here? That sometimes works, more often does not. You've really got to try to find ways of putting things in their context and seeing how this particular episode fits within that larger arc of other episodes, both immediately around it and within the arc of the scriptures as a whole. Then things begin to take on a slightly different light. That doesn't say that the hardness of these stories, the difficulties of these stories go away. It gives us a framework for contextualizing that.
Well, it would have changed whose daughter was it Simeon's daughter or was it Shechem's daughter that then went on later in the story?
The
Daughter, but Simeon took her away from him and married her, then, was she already pregnant when that happened?
The question was, whose daughter is the one who ends up in Egypt? In the tradition that tells that particular story, the daughter is Shechem's and Dinah's. Yeah. Okay. Any last-minute questions? Okay. I'm happy to stick around for just a few moments, but otherwise, those of you who are heading to the luncheon, please enjoy your luncheon. The rest of you, thanks very much for coming. We'll see you next week.